Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's March 12th, 2021 program, Attack on the U.S. Capitol, Impact on the Republic and the Republican Party. This is the 24th program of our 2020-2021 programming year. My name is Scott Coltrane, and I'm the City Club President. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and our sponsors. You can become a member of the City Club at our website, cityclubofeugene.org. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, and our broadcast on public radio station KLCC 89.7 on Mondays at 7 p.m. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors, Kaiser Permanente, University of Oregon, Peace Health, and Lane Community College, as well as generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. In today's program, we welcome presenters David Niewert, Priscilla Southwell, and Peter Walker. David Niewert is an investigative journalist and author based in Seattle. Priscilla Southwell is Professor Emerita of the Political Science at the University of Oregon, and Peter Walker is a professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon. Biographical information on our speakers is available on our website, cityclubofeugene.org. I would like to thank Joel Corin for coordinating today's program. Not since the War of 1812 has there been an attack on the U.S. Capitol. The long record of Capitol security was broken on January 6, 2021, and this time the assault was not done by a foreign army, but by U.S. citizens. The attack in January on the Capitol will have consequences as yet unknown for the country and the Republican Party. A special commission will investigate the causes of the riot and propose some form of corrective action. How much future threat will be presented by those who stormed the Capitol? What are the likely impacts of the home district censures of House Republicans who voted to impeach and Senate Republicans who voted to convict the former president? Now, private citizen Trump is at war with Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and those who voted against him. There is talk of starting another party. Where will it all end? Come here, experts, political analysts give their opinions about what happens next in today's program. Our format today includes a question and answer period with City Club members via Zoom.
So, my name's David Niewert. I'm an investigative journalist based in Seattle, and I've been writing about the radical right for well over 30 years. That's kind of the story that I'm going to tell folks today, just so that because I think it helps set the scene for what our subject matter here, which is right-wing extremism. And my first encounter with it, I grew up in Southern Idaho as a moderate Republican, and I was working at my first newspaper job was in Sandpoint, Idaho, up in the Panhandle, back in the late 70s, and that was at the time when the Aryan nations moved in to a town just 20 miles south of us called Hayden Lake, and that sort of became the predicate for everything that we wound up, or that I wound up writing about for many, many years, including right to this day. We actually made what we thought was the astute decision not to cover them, because we thought that, these guys just want attention, and we're not going to give it to them. So we deliberately did not cover the activities of the Aryan nations until they started, of course, committing dozens of hate crimes and bank robberies and all kinds of criminality that came out of there. And at that point, of course, it culminated in the Rampage of the Order, the neo-Nazi gang that operated out of Aryan nations in 1984, of that was really kind of a landmark domestic terrorism case. And, by then I was, of course, reporting on all this stuff as criminal activity and was attending, airing congresses and that sort of thing. Um, that was really just part of my work as a newspaper reporter. I was a cops and court reporter for many years and then became an environmental reporter. And that was about the time I moved out to Seattle and started writing about militias in the 1990s because I could see that the radical right was continuing to organize um, these, but really in a different way, in a way that was intended to mainstream them. And they called these militias, or, more generically, they called themselves the Patriot Movement. And that Patriot Movement, basically was sort of diluted version of old posse comitatus ideology, constitutionalism, and that sort of thing. Constitutionalists believe in this very radical version of localism that basically says that the federal government has no power to enforce civil rights laws, has no right to own public lands, has no right to direct children's education, has no right to collect taxes, whatever, and argues, in fact, for the forming of local militias as a guard against government overreach. Government tyranny, as they called it, which is, a lot of constitutionalists believe that we haven't had a legitimate government since, I think, 1871 or something like that. So, there's a lot of crazy theories, a lot of crazy stuff that comes around with this movement, and you kind of learn to roll with it. But when the Oklahoma City bombing happened in 1995, I found myself suddenly becoming an expert in these right-wing extremists, and not only that, it was becoming apparent that this was going to be a major source of stories for me for a very long time. I was convinced by a pastor who'd had his home bombed by the order, man named Father Bill Wasmuth, who organized an outfit called the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. And he basically convinced me to make it my beat. And this is in 1995, after Oklahoma City happened. And so I did, because I had been writing about them for some time, and then made it really kind of a dedicated beat. And I've tried to stay on top of it over the years. The Patriot Movement has kind of come and gone. It went through. There was a lot of, sort of repercussions for the militia movement after Oklahoma City, but it still kept gaining recruits all through the late 90s, mostly built around its New World Order conspiracy theories. And these kind of came to a head during the Y2K phenomenon, the Y2K apocalypse that was being predicted in late 1999. And the Patriots got really involved in pushing those theories. And then suddenly, after no apocalypse appeared, a lot of the people who had their basements full of rice and beans and other apocalyptic supplies felt pretty foolish and realized that they had been had, because honestly, I haven't yet encountered a right-wing extremist organization that at its bottom isn't a kind of scam. And a lot of people get taken for a lot of rides. So I went into a sort of downturn, especially during the Bush years. But the conspiracy theories kept growing, particularly around the so-called 9/11 truther movement. And then we also started seeing a lot of far right organizing, including militias, around the immigration issue. Remember the Minutemen of the 2005 and 6 era. Those folks were all basically patriots. They called themselves, members of the Patriot Movement. And those the Minutemen were border militias. And then after Barack Obama was elected in 2008, really everything changed. We saw the numbers increase, numbers of militias increase from 131 to 500 or so in just 1 year. And by 2011, we saw militia numbers reach their peak at something like 1,200 of them in the United States. They've gone down since then, but that's because radicalization started happening more and more online, and so there was a lot less organizational recruiting. But there was also a lot of radicalization going on through the auspices of the Tea Party, which also was a reaction to Barack Obama's presidency. And, you know, you'll recall all the conspiracy theories that were blown up around Obama's presidency, not least of which was the birther conspiracy theory, which was the predicate of Donald Trump's political career. And that was, but at the same time, we were seeing a lot more domestic terrorism. We also started seeing these organizations like the Oath Keepers and the 3%er militias starting to organize more and more around. And these were very clearly Patriot Movement organizations. They spouted the same New World Order, United Nations conspiracy theories as these folks in the 90s. And I would go to Tea Party meetings, you know, in 2009 and 2010, that frankly, especially out in rural places like Montana, they were indistinguishable from the militia meetings that I used to go to in the 1990s. And this already started coming to head first in 2014 with the Bundy ranch standoff in Nevada. The Bundy family were constitutionalists, and they started, you know, that standoff, that armed standoff that they had there in April of 2014, wound up being really the base of a lot of far right organizing that we saw in the subsequent years. Not least of which, of course, was in the Malheur. But even before that, there was organizing elsewhere in the West, particularly in down in the Grants Pass, Bedford area, around the Sugar Pine mine. The Oath Keepers attempted to do a sort of Bundy-style standoff down there, and it wound up not having the necessary predicates for it. And then, of course, just a few months, I think 6 months after that standoff fizzled out, then the events in Burns took place. And I'll let Peter really talk about that. Finally, and then the other thing that, of course, has been happening, particularly in the Northwest, has been the arrival of these, basically, I call them street brawling, street thugs, very pseudo-fascist groups like the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer. Now, as it happened, I was in Red Square on the night of Trump's inauguration in Red Square in University of Washington in Seattle, where Milo Yiannopoulos, the alt-right figure, was having a speech, and there were thousands of people turned out to protest his presence. And it turned into this giant brawl between basically anti-fascists and the Milo fans. And a young anti-fascist that I was standing next to was shot. And I wound up being a witness in the trial of the alt-right couple that was responsible for shooting him. And that was really my first whiff of what was going to be coming, because within a few months of that, I was down in Berkeley covering. I should mention I was writing all this time beginning in 2013 for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and that was who I was writing for. I was hired away in 2019 by Daily Kos, and that's who I write for currently. But a lot of what I'm talking about here today was out of my SPLC coverage. And we were seeing down in Berkeley in April, I think it was April 15th of 2017. There was this huge, it was actually the very first Proud Boys event there, and it attracted white nationalists and neo-Nazis of various stripes, and was an incredibly violent event. And one of the people who was there was this guy named Joey Gibson, who wound up forming an outfit based on the Proud Boys up in the Portland area. He actually lives in Vancouver, Washington. And he started organizing these events where basically it became this strategy that we saw evolving involved recruiting angry MAGA folks from mostly rural areas or ex-urban areas to come together to go to these urban liberal areas where they knew there were particularly going to be anti-fascists who would turn out to oppose them, with the intention of creating scenes of violence, just like we saw in Berkeley and in Seattle. And the whole purpose of these events, they used various causes. I think the first really big Patriot Prayer one was right after the Portland Max stabbings, where a guy who had been a participant in Patriot Prayer um, marches had stabbed 2 people to death on a Portland Max train. And they held their rally, within the week, even after that event, even though people asked them not to. And that was really a huge event that had, lots of Oath Keepers and white nationalists and Proud Boys there. And it turned into another extremely violent event. And they organized that one under the pretense of, we're here for free speech. And the causes and they wound up having just this regular sequence of events. They would hold them sometimes in Seattle, sometimes in Portland, sometimes in Olympia. And Joey wound up traveling all over the country and doing rallies elsewhere. And this wound up, this is one of the reasons. What they were really about was creating this narrative of violent left that they would use. And towards the end, particularly going into 2020, we saw them organizing around the COVID-19 pandemic, very similar sort of response. And then ultimately we saw them do this with the Trump trains, these caravans, these vehicle caravans that they would drive their big pickups with, festooned with Trump and Gadsden flags and Blue Lives Matter flags through these urban liberal areas, and shooting people with paintball guns from the back end of their pickups and things like that, and trying to cause trouble. So that was those were a lot of the events. And of course, we can talk also about what's been happening in Portland as part of this scene. As you know, this same crew invaded the Portland, or the state capitol in Salem. In fact, it was at the end of one of these Trump trains that they first attempted to do so. And after the election, we saw the Trump trains become the Stop the Steal people. I mean, it was the very same people, because what we were seeing at the Trump train events was this commingling of regular Trump supporters, sort of, just bellicose Republicans, and these radicalized far-right extremists, particularly from the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, who they then, basically embraced as their own. So that's pretty much the history of how we got to where we are with the radical right in the Northwest. It has a long history here, and I can talk at length about all of that history if anybody has questions. But mostly, I just wanted to sort of set the stage for, that's how we got to where we are today. And Peter, I believe you're next. Shall I hand that off to you, Peter?
When Joel proposed this City Club event, I complained that there's nothing I can really say about the far right that Dave Neiwert can't say more authoritatively. The one possible exception is the 2016 armed takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, which I observed personally. Given that experience, I was surprised when a spate of news reports suggested that the Malheur takeover, quote, set the stage, unquote, for the January 6th attacks on the US Capitol. I understand why the two events appeared similar. There were a lot of angry, mostly white men with camouflage and flags and weapons who violently seized a government building. But there are also some fundamental differences that are very important to understand. I'll always remember the bizarre experience of standing in the January deep freeze at the occupied Malheur Refuge in a place where normally the only regular outside visitors are bird watchers, with their bird watchers guides that help them to distinguish between different species that look a lot alike to me. Instead, I was trying to understand the different groups of militia that had migrated to the refuge. I've spent the last 5 years thinking about that, and in that spirit, I'd like to offer my own birdwatcher's guide to the far right. The flocks can be hard to tell apart because they don't always sort themselves into clearly defined groups, and sometimes they mingle together and other times they separate depending on their immediate needs. But the differences were hard to miss at the Malheur occupation. The militia at the refuge, including the Oath Keepers and the so-called 3%ers, were at times openly at odds with the leaders of the occupation, Ammon Bundy and his brother Ryan and their supporters. At times, the differences produced verbal altercations and even fistfights. Some militia groups even publicly stated their opposition to the refuge takeover. The national leadership of the Oath Keepers militia wrote on their webpage that the Bundys' takeover of the refuge was, and I apologize for the language, a, quote, clinically retarded maneuver, unquote. Now, not everybody will agree with the taxonomy on my militia birdwatchers list, but I came to understand the differences this way. The national militia groups, such as the Oath Keepers and 3%ers, basically opposed the government of then President Barack Obama, a Black man they considered falsely described as a foreigner and a Muslim. And more generally, they opposed multiculturalism, elitism, the mainstream media, and so on. I believe that they're not inherently opposed to all government. In fact, I'm convinced that most of them would be fine with authoritarian rule so long as the authoritarian ruler is one of their own. Although we hear in the conservative media currently otherwise, in my observation, there's simply no question that the core motivations of the militia that we're seeing are racism and hate. Their motivating ideology is that non-Jewish people and cultures of European descent are superior, and they perceive white culture to be under threat. They even speak of a so-called white genocide. So I wasn't surprised at all that these groups immediately recognized the words of Donald Trump when he promised to make America great again and defended Nazi and KKK protesters as, quote, very fine people. The far-right militia were primed to receive that message, and they at least believed that they knew exactly what Trump was talking about. Many in that community openly welcome and actively seek a race war, or what they sometimes call a second American Revolution. Certainly many of those groups were present at the Malheur occupation, but I think it was largely because they couldn't resist the revolutionary scent and the opportunity to be in front of TV cameras. But I would argue that Ammon Bundy represented a different kind of ideology. The Bundy family comes from a fringe, hard-right periphery of Mormonism in which eccentric interpretations of the Constitution and opposition to virtually all federal government are literally matters of faith. The main Mormon church explicitly condemned the Malheur Refuge takeover and stated that it had no basis in scripture. But the Bundy family has very specific and highly controversial beliefs about the Constitution, including the notion that it forbids the federal government from owning land outside of Washington, D.C., and that county sheriffs are the highest officials in the country, literally with more authority than the President of the United States. Ammon Bundy's goal at the Malheur takeover was to launch a wave of anti-federal government actions that would force the federal government out of the West and replace it with something else altogether. I can say that with confidence because I asked Ammon Bundy that exact question myself during the takeover, and he said yes. I can also say that the main motivation for Ammon Bundy and his followers is not racism or race war. To be clear, the Bundy family does have repugnant racial views that were on full display, for example, by Ammon's father, Cliven Bundy, at the Bundy Ranch standoff in Nevada in 2014. But unlike many in the militia movement, racism and race war are not the primary ideological drivers of their anti-government actions. Mostly, the Bundy-style constitutionalists are about a religiously driven kind of super libertarianism. That ideology rejects any kind of nationalist authoritarian leader, what they call a king. So maybe you can see why I say that the attack on the US Capitol on January 6th felt very different from what I observed at the Malheur Refuge takeover. I think it's important to make that distinction because it's key to thinking about what we can do as a society to respond to the dangerous destabilization of American politics we've seen. Last week, there was a very interesting article in the Washington Post that described a call by a group of educators calling for an overhaul of the way civics and history are taught to American students. And I absolutely agree. The near absence of civics and history in our educational system seems inexcusable to me and deeply worrying. I think that such an effort would be hugely valuable and could have some, and I emphasize some, beneficial effect in stabilizing our political culture. It's even conceivable to me that some in the Bundy-style breed of constitutionalists may be willing to accept viable alternatives to full-blown revolution and civil war. In the book that I wrote about the takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, I presented evidence that in a deeply conservative, generally anti-government Eastern Oregon community, the Bundy constitutionalists found very little support, mainly because most people in the community had invested in collaborative processes of public decision-making about land and resources that were important to them. Collaboration gave the community a voice and a stake in the existing political structure. So it came as a grave disappointment to Ammon Bundy that the community had little interest in overthrowing a system that works pretty well for them. In contrast, I think the far-right militia are so cognitively separated into their own universe that no amount of civics education is going to make a dent. And here I'm borrowing from Dave's book, Alt America, that studies a cognitive community that he calls Alt America, a community where no amount of presentation of facts will get through. A community where such an effort would almost certainly only reinforce perceptions of a mainstream media and so-called liberal elite indoctrination campaign. I honestly don't have any clear ideas to offer about how we can bring our friends, our fellow citizens, neighbors, and family members back from that universe. We absolutely need civics education, but we must also find a way to reach out and talk to that community that Dave calls Alt America. That universe was created over a period of decades, and it won't be changed in any short amount of time. But it's absolutely urgent that we do think about that question of how to reach out to that community, because there are some, maybe a small number, but enough in that community who will take the most extreme and dangerous path. In 1995, a white supremacist former soldier named Timothy McVeigh bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. 168 people, including 19 children, were murdered. We need to find a way to talk with that Alt America, because I believe the threat we face today is far more grave than what we saw at the Malheur Refuge. based on my experience, what we witnessed in the January 6th takeover of the US Capitol was less like Ammon Bundy's attempted constitutionalist revolution at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge than it was like the white supremacist authoritarian attack by Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City in 1995. And we need to recognize that.
My name is Priscilla Southwell. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Oregon, and my research has centered on political parties and elections. So my task is a little bit, and my subject is a little bit different than that of the previous two speakers. It's much more conventional what I'm going to talk about, which is what is the future of the Republican Party in the United States, or is there a future? And this is not a topic that I am uniquely able to comment about because it's actually been the focus of a lot of debate. And in fact, the new issue, the upcoming issue of the New Yorker has a whole spread, a whole article dedicated to it as an editorial in today's New York Times. So I'm going to start with a sort of have a list thing and about what's troubling people who are Republicans, who were Republicans, and looking ahead to 2022 and of course the next presidential election. The only good news that I'll start out with is that it does not appear that there is going to be a third party movement, that Donald Trump at the CPAC speech, the Conservative Political Action Conference last month, indicated, no, there will be no Patriot Party. This is really good news for the Republican Party because I think Trump and his advisors and everyone else knows that all it would do would be split the Republican vote or the Republican leaning vote and end up like 1912, where that same thing happened and with Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party and guaranteed the election of the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. All right, the other thing, moving on to what should and has given a lot of concern to moderate Republicans, centrist Republicans, or even people who just want to see the Republican Party not go the way of the Whigs or the Federalists, is that the registration figures are tumbling. The number of people who have registered as a Republican is now behind nationwide those who are either listed as independents or non-affiliated. And Oregon is a prime example of this. Since the election day, since November, 11,000 people have changed their registration from Republican to what's in Oregon is called non-affiliated. And 6,000 of those 11,000 have occurred in January. So, and you all have heard of the former gubernatorial candidate, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Newt Buehler, especially after the statement by the Oregon Republican Party, was one of those people that changed his registration. And he said, I don't even recognize the party anymore. So they're all those, one other thing. And then across the nation, you've seen censures usually by state parties of anyone who was a Trump critic, and certainly any one of the Republicans who voted to either impeach former President Trump in the House or to convict him in the Senate. Those individuals, either if they're not censored by their House party, their state party, then they're also facing primary challenges. Again, I don't think this is actually a very productive move on the part of the Republican Party because these people, even the ones that criticize Trump, are incumbents and they're likely to get reelected at the next election. So you challenge them, you're just going to spend a great deal more of Republican money trying to get rid of people that actually are incumbents and might help to increase the number of House members or Senate members in future elections. The thing that I think is most disturbing also is to look across the land and see the number of moderate Republicans who are retiring from office. Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, other ones are probably the most outspoken and the most straightforward about why they don't want to be in politics anymore. But it's also happening with a lot of Republican members of the House. So again, these are incumbents who, which always gives an advantage to a party, and they're disappearing from the scene. I think the other disturbing trend is what's happening in all of the states about which I won't mince words, which is voter suppression. Probably the most vigorous attempts at voter suppression is in the state of Georgia. They have a slew of bills that have gotten out of committee. Many of them have been passed. And the whole idea is, in essence, they will say it's to ensure the integrity of the act of voting. I will call it, and many other people have called it, voter suppression. And it's particularly dangerous in the sense that their tactics and what they're trying to do is clearly directed against Black voters. So for the example of preventing early voting on Sundays. This is something that is called, souls to the polls, and lots of Black members, and there are a lot of them Democrats, often will go to church on Sunday and then go and in some way drop off their ballot in a drop box. So the Georgia Republicans are trying whatever they can. They have all kinds of things, as I said. There's about 20 different proposed legislation, and some of which has actually been put into law. They want to reduce the number of drop-off boxes. They do not want automatic voter registration. They're trying to do everything they possibly can, in essence, as they perceive it, to depress or suppress turnout among likely Democrats. I find this extremely counterproductive from the standpoint of, I'm not quite sure that these Republican legislators are really very good strategists, because a lot of the people that whose vote they will suppress will be older white voters who often vote absentee or vote by mail. And so in essence, they're almost shooting themselves in the foot by not only keeping down people whom they think are likely Democratic voters, they're also just suppressing the vote of likely Republican voters. And it's in many ways, it's just not only counterproductive, but you sort of say, why would you do this? Why wouldn't you do, as Senator Klobuchar, a Democratic senator from Minnesota, says, why wouldn't you just, if your party was in trouble, why wouldn't you start to say, well, what can we do differently? What policies might we propose, as opposed to oppose policies that could attract more voters within our ranks? I mean, there's clearly a minefield out there of likely Republican voters, but the Republican voters have to sit there and say, let's draw them into the fold. I'll mention in particular, say, Latino males who seem to, in a previous election and even in other types of elections over the last decade, seem to be, not all of them, but they seem a good number of them gravitate to the Republican Party. So in essence, those people were also in various states, not so much in Georgia, are going to find it more difficult to vote. So as I said, it's not exactly a strategy that is likely to be successful. It's just likely to make a lot of people angry, in part because vote by mail, especially after people did this experiment, is very popular. I wrote about this at the London School of Economics on their forum, saying states are going to be surprised exactly how many people say, this is not such a bad idea, let's do it. So Republicans, might want to think about it. All right, the other things that we need to talk about, I suppose, is the future, and that's what I was asked to do, sort of look into the crystal ball. I expect that the Republicans are going to pick up seats in the House in 2022, and the 1/3 of the Senate seats that are up. That always happens. It's the end of the honeymoon period, so they can think about that. In terms of the next presidential election, I guess the big $64,000 question is, who's going to run against Trump? Because he clearly has thrown his hat in the ring. And who is it going to be? Is it going to be Mike Pence? Is it going to be Jeb Bush? They have to, if the anti-Trumpers or the people who don't want to see him get the nomination have to rally behind early a single voice. And that's one of the reasons why in 2016, Trump managed to get the nomination, is that there were so many Republicans vying for that position. And so that's the kind of thing they're going to have to organize and be better focused. The other bit of not so good news, at least in terms of the presidential race, is that big money big money is wary. The big Republican donors are wary of Trump. They've spent most of their money in terms of House and Senate races, and in many cases were successfully doing so. So that's going to be a real obstacle for Donald Trump in terms of getting the nomination in 2024. And for the people who are worried about a Trump nomination, perhaps that money will go to another one of these potential presidential candidates and give them an advantage. So again, there's a lot going on out there. There's a lot of difficult, heated exchanges between Republicans, and not just between Republicans and Democrats on the floor of the House and Senate, but also in what's going to happen to our party and what do we do about it. When we have this figure here that seems to dominate the party, and anyone who dares question anything gets attacked, not just by him, but by a lot of other of the more vocal Republican leaders. So we are now going to turn this over to an open forum and have questions and answers. So thank you.
Joel Curran, and I'm the coordinator for this program. We're now going to go into the question and answer period. And the first question is by Karin Knudsen.
Thank you to our speakers today for that very fascinating presentation and the more detailed history lesson. I think a lot of us had heard some of those stories, but not nearly the connecting of the dots that you all shared. I was particularly struck by several things, but Peter Walker mentioned something that I wanted to use to frame a question. Peter, you mentioned that with regards to certain extremist perspectives, that no amount of presentation of fact will matter in bringing someone who has moved into a certain position back to a more engaged and sociable relationship with society. And the echo to much of the commentary on former President Trump's position regarding whether or not he had won or lost the election, and the refusal to engage with that fact has been a really troubling way of seeming to evade responsibility of all types and accountability for actions. And I'm wondering if David, Peter, and Priscilla, if the three of you could say a little bit about how we get back to a place where fact and accountability are actively being supported by our shared government.
Dave, you want to take the first crack at that?
Sure. Well, so actually, I have a book that I wrote after Alt America titled Red Pill, Blue Pill, How to Counteract the Conspiracy Theories That Are Killing Us. And it really is kind of a look, what I really tried to do was look at how conspiracy theories and disinformation warp our sense of reality and create this very unhinged kind of behavior frequently. There are some things we can do as a society that are definite steps. We definitely need to have social media reform in a way that requires basically or encourages, I don't know, how we go about it, but social media platforms need to stop being platforms for the deliberate distribution of false information. And I don't think that that's a matter that kind of deliberate disinformation campaign. I just really have questions about it being a form of free speech. I think that's something we need to think long and hard about. And also there are steps there are also steps that we should need to take in terms of larger media reform, because one of the things that happens is that these conspiracy theories and this false information bubbles up out of the internet and makes its way onto Fox News, and then from Fox News onto CNN, and gets rehashed and distributed and legitimized in ways that it is not on the internet. So this has a really profound effect in terms of the shape of our public discourse. And you know, I don't think a democracy can withstand this kind of false information, because it absolutely destroys discourse that is the requisite, you know, the real foundations of any kind of healthy democracy. Finally, how do you pull people out of these rabbit holes? How do we get all these people to pull out of these rabbit holes? I don't think there's any easy solution to that. My experience has been that the more you talk facts and logic and reason with them, the more resistant they become. What does work for de-radicalization is an empathetic approach involving basically very slow, patient, one at a time de-radicalization by somebody who actually has a relationship with the person who's gone down the rabbit hole. And so that's going to be a very slow, painful process. We do need to have in place a media and a government that encourages that kind of discourse, that kind of fact-based discourse. And also we need to find ways to really eliminate it's just been not just a fire hose, it's been a deluge of misinformation, and, you know, in the words of the radical right people who promoted it, just a flood of shit, you know, and they do it intentionally. They know it.
Peter, do you have any comment?
I don't know where Peter is.
I can respond to and emphasize what Peter said about civic education. And I think that if it's going to be, if it's deemed difficult or nearly impossible to convince people out of these violent tendencies, then let's move on to their children. And I mean, when I was in high school, I was required to take a civics class. It was just required for graduation. And in it, we studied the US Constitution and the Illinois Constitution. And I think it could start even before high school. I think it's just, if you have a counterpart to what they're hearing at home or whatever, I mean, that's what of course, I've been in an educational institution for over 40 years. So it's, but I have faith in that. And I think it needs to start early.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
I would say not just, I think we also need to think in terms of our modern age, in terms of the internet, but we really, I think what we all need, but particularly young people need, is media, is literacy in consuming modern media, being able to understand when they're being fed false information and when they're not. This is something that, you know, and you can't, there's actually a good, a guy named Mike Caulfield there at WSU Vancouver, who's done a lot of work on this, on creating, you know, media literacy programs for young people, because it's going to be really essential. I mean, this is how the misinformation spreads. You know, we look at like the case of Dylan Roof, the kid who, murdered all those folks in the church in Charleston. He went down that path of radicalization on the internet by doing bad Google searches and not having the media literacy that would tell him when he was running into toxic false information and not. So yeah, I think that that's one of the areas that you know, we definitely need to focus with young people.
Let me jump in and just add one aspect to that, which is I completely agree about the need to educate young people about how to use the internet responsibly, how to interpret information from the internet, and about the responsibilities of internet and media service providers. I would add one aspect, which is just empathy. And I think Dave mentioned the word empathy briefly. But I'd like to drive that home a little bit, which was one of the things I noticed while sort of hanging around the militia at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in 2016, was that these were a lot of, I don't know how to put it, but these are a lot of kind of lost souls, in my view. They were people who were looking for direction and meaning in their lives. And I think, unfortunately, what that does psychologically is it makes them receptive to all kinds of messages that seem crazy to us, because those messages become a community. And those people, when they talk to each other and they reinforce their perceptions about things that are frankly just fabricated information, it doesn't matter that it's fabricated to them as much as the fact that they're in a community talking to people who they feel respect them and understand them. And it fulfills a genuine human need. And I think that in approaching these questions of how to reach out to people in that community, I think we always have to keep in mind that these are people, these are human beings, and that to the extent that people, say, on the west side of the Cascades Mountains might sometimes talk about people on the east side of the Cascade Mountains as being, uneducated and unsophisticated and so on. We really need to get away from that and remember that we're talking about humans and treat them respectfully, because you're just not going to reach out to people and connect with them any other way.
Our next question is from Scott Coltrane.
Yeah, so it's kind of a two-part question for David and Peter. I happened to be in the state capitol in Salem about 4 years ago on Open Carry Day, and there were a lot of militia types there with guns parading around inside the state capitol. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the overlap with gun rights issues and what's happening with the NRA, and the kind of overlap for those. And for Priscilla, maybe comment on the break-in at Salem and what the prospects are for state level change in that area.
Who wants to start?
I'll go ahead and start. Sure. Well, the gun rights, have always been a really key component, really, from the very get-go of the Patriot Movement. And it was a primary recruiting tool and a way that the radical right was able to mainstream itself. And maybe the best way to explain it is to step back a little bit. One of the things that, when we've written, certainly when I was at SPLC, we typically described the Patriot Movement as anti-government. And I think that that's, a useful term, that the militias are anti-government militias. But the more that I was around the movement, the more I spent time with them, the more I realized that really they weren't so much anti-government, because they were fine with government. They just wanted their government. They wanted their kind of government, which was this radically decentralized version that wouldn't be able to enforce civil rights or environmental laws, right? And that was, and really the more I watched their behavior, the more I listened to them, and particularly over the last 10 years, what I really kind of came to the conclusion of is that a much better description of them is anti-democratic. And I think really January 6th was the apotheosis of that. That really their nascent, their growing anti-democratic tendencies really kind of came to fruition on that day. And it encompasses things like vote suppression and the anti-immigrant nativism and things like that. And really the underlying phenomenon of this anti-democratic movement, the thing that really is sort of the nub that makes them anti-democratic, is authoritarianism. This is a right-wing authoritarian movement, and what they wanted to do on January 6th was replace a democratic government with a right-wing authoritarian government. And this is ultimately what their drive is about. And guns have played a really key role in being able to do that, because They know that they can threaten and intimidate people with guns. This is what open carry is about. This is why they all have to have their freaking AR-15s. My dad was a gunsmith, and so was my grandfather. I grew up around guns and grew up hunting, and I've never understood anybody who needs to have a goddamn AR-15. It's like, what are you? Okay. Anyway, that's just my own attitudes. But you know what I'm saying? That the fetish about guns, and of course it also has a psychosexual component and so on and so forth, but ultimately it has this, it's really what it is an underlying statement that they are fearful, that there is a lot of fear that drives them into this position. And of course, one of the real things that we know about authoritarianism, besides its fondness for conspiracy theories, its reliance on disinformation and false information. But more than anything, that we know that people are psychologically predisposed to revert to an authoritarian response when they are fearful, when they're made to be fearful. This is why Trump was constantly fear-mongering about, caravans or whatever. Of course, it was Antifa in the past year. And so that's really kind of at the root of how I think it works, Scott.
Can I add, my experience with the gun issue, of course, is somewhat limited to the experience at the Malheur Refuge takeover. But I remember at that time, everybody at the Malheur Refuge was armed to the teeth. I mean, it was kind of a cultural thing. Dave used the word fetish, and I agree with that. It was a cultural thing in the sense that they're sort of showing off their guns to each other and so on. But I remember that a reporter asked Ryan Bundy, the brother of Ammon Bundy, why are you guys armed to the teeth? What's the point of this? And Ryan's actually a less sort of filtered public speaker than his brother. And he gave what I thought was actually a pretty honest response. He said, because that's the only way you people will take us seriously. I think that was actually a pretty meaningful response in the sense that there is this community that feels culturally and politically marginalized, disenfranchised, and so on. They perceive, I think incorrectly, that the only way they're going to be taken seriously is if they're armed. And that worked for them to some extent at the Malheur Refuge, but also it failed to work because the supporters in the community who they recognized that they needed the support of the community in order to achieve their revolutionary takeover, and that didn't materialize for them. And the reason that didn't materialize in the community was that the community already felt enfranchised by this collaborative process. The government was literally sitting down at a table and listening to people in this community. And so when the community was asked to use guns to achieve a political end, the community responded, we already have a way to speak to the government, to speak to the environmentalists, to speak to the people on the west side of the Cascades, and it's working. And so we don't need guns. We don't need this armed revolution. And so I think giving people opportunities in that community, giving people opportunities to be heard, to feel like they have a voice in the society without having to pull out their AK-47 or the AR-15, et cetera, is just incredibly important.
Thank you. Priscilla?
I just want to build on that. That's one reason why I cringe every time I have heard, who made these words, when people are called deplorable or Neanderthal. I just think you can use other adjectives because all it does is kind of fuel the flames. Back to what our kind of precursor of January 6th in terms of what happened in Salem, what happened at our Capitol right before Christmas of last year. Again, Dallas Hurd was the senator from Roseburg, he was just a sort of pale imitation of Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani, 3 weeks later, and he just said, I work with fools. You belong in there to the crowd instead of them. And then, so Mike Meerman, the House representative from Independence, he lists them in. And, you know, the consequences were very different from both of these men. Dallas Hurd was just chosen as the head of the Republican Party of Oregon. On the other hand, Mike Neerman, you know, you have a Democratic House Speaker, Tina Kotek, and she just said this is unacceptable. And so far, all he's faced is, you know, $2,000 fine, and he's stripped of his committee assignments, etc. But there is a criminal investigation going on that has nothing actually to do with politics. So, you know, you can't get away with everything. Maybe Dallas Hurd did. He definitely was inciting the crowd. Mike Neerman, not so much.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I have more questions, but no more time to ask them. So I want to thank you for a fascinating program today.
Right.
Thank you for having me.
This has been our March 12th, 2021 program, Attack on the U.S. Capitol, Impact on the Republic and the Republican Party. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, UO has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, our mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. I would like to acknowledge our gold sponsors: Emergency Veterinary Hospital, Sacred Earth Botanicals, and our Sapphire sponsor, Summit Bank, your local community bank. An independent community bank headquartered in Eugene, Summit Bank serves businesses and professionals in Eugene, Springfield, and Central Oregon communities. For more information, visit sbko.bank. Before we thank our speakers today, I have a few more quick announcements. Thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing, LLC, and Dotson's Photography. And a special thank you to public radio station KLCC FM 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. If you're a City Club of Eugene member, you can ask a question at a future taping of our programs. If you are not yet a member, you can join and then participate. More information is on our website, cityclubofeugene.org. Next week, our program focuses on Falling Behind, Solving Oregon's Addiction Crisis. More details and information about future programs can be found online at the City Club's website. Now, I would like to thank today's speakers for a great program. Peter Walker, David Newert, and Priscilla Southwell, thanks for a great session. This concludes today's program. Be well and stay safe.